I'll just say just a couple of words of welcome and good morning. My name is Julia Roig, and I'm president of Partners for Democratic Change, and it's a big pleasure to welcome you all here. I really appreciate on a very cold Tuesday morning that you made the trek out to join us in person, and to say thank you to all of you who are joining us virtually, because we're thrilled that we're able to telecast the discussion today, and we have a lot of friends and colleagues all over the world who let us know that they were going to join in. So with that, I'm actually going to be wrapping up with some comments at the end of the presentation, so I'm not going to say much more other than just to introduce a special colleague and supporter of Partners Works for many years, Karan Bhatia, who will be introducing Deb and the panel. Thank you.
Julia, thanks very much, and it's great to be back here with Partners and to see so many friends out there. Thanks all for taking time today. It's my principal charge to introduce my colleague and friend Deb Elam, but before I do that, let me just say just a couple of words about who I am and why Partners is relevant to me and to us at GE, at least in the government affairs function. I lead global government affairs and policy for General Electric, and in that job, my role is really to work with our businesses and our teams around the world to help shape a policy environment, a government policy environment that enables GE, a big multinational operating in more than 180 countries around the world, to operate effectively in markets around the world, very different markets in many cases, and to grow. And we, as a function, our global government affairs function, we advocate, as you might imagine, for sound pro-growth policies in these countries. We do so directly, working with the governments. We do so working with other governments or international institutions. We work with think tanks. We work with universities. And typically we engage on the kinds of topics that you might imagine a company like GE with a lot of different industrial sector interests to engage on. So we'll work on energy policy, we'll work on healthcare policy, transportation issues, and we also work on sort of broader macroeconomic kinds of issues, things like trade policy, let's say. But I think what we found, and maybe this isn't surprising, but that for all of our engagement on all of these sort of sector-specific or other areas of policy, the foundation, the ultimate determinant of whether we're going to be successful, whether we're going to get good policies in these countries around the world, is often the much more fundamental question of whether there is peace, whether there's political stability, and whether there is sort of inclusive political systems that enable engagement on these other kinds of issues to be fruitful and be successful. And I think this is becoming increasingly important, this focus on the stability, peace, and inclusive political inclusion for us as we become more and more engaged in markets around the world where those factors can't be taken as a given. And that's the future that we see. We see ourselves more and more growing in markets, fast emerging, but often fairly, in some states, fragile political environments around the world. Now, for a company like GE, and probably for many other multinational companies, promotion of political stability, promotion of peace and political inclusion, those are not topics that come naturally to a multinational company. It's not that we disavow them, they're just not in our sweet spot naturally. And so the last few years really has been, I think, a process within our own function of becoming more thoughtful and more engaged and trying to connect more with institutions that have greater expertise in this area. And that really is sort of my lead in to Partners for Democratic Change, because they are experts in this area in a way that we frankly have not been. We found them to be very engaging and good partners to us as a company. And that their approach to the issues of conflict management, to issues of rule of law, really works very well with how a private sector company like ours thinks about tasks. It's a very localized approach, as you'll hear. It's a very targeted approach often, and it's quite entrepreneurial. And I think in today's discussion that will all come out. Now, GE's partnership with PDC has really had two aspects. One is the engagement that our business teams, our operating people around the world, different countries around the world, have had with PDC centers in different places. So to take as an example, Colombia or Brazil, we've had engagement with our teams there working with PDC teams on the ground to identify who key stakeholders are to be brought into the process, to identify core topics and issues, and help them think about how they structure their operations. And that's been a very successful and from our perspective, rewarding sort of day-to-day kind of engagement. But the other engagement certainly has been through the GE Foundation. And there, it's been a durable, multi-year relationship, and one that I think, and Deb and we'll certainly talk more about it, has been a great learning experience for us, and I think an engagement that's been helpful to partners as well. So let me stop there. Let me just briefly introduce Deb Elam. Deb is president of the GE Foundation and chief diversity officer for GE. Deb works at the corporate headquarters in Fairfield, Connecticut, and leads our efforts to bring GE employees closer to their communities while maintaining diversity and inclusiveness as an essential part of GE's productivity, creativity, innovation, and competitive advantage. She has a fantastic career story at GE. She started out 26 years ago working at GE as an intern, I believe, while in graduate school. And upon graduation, she joined GE's Human Resources Department and worked her way. I won't name all the different multiple GE entities, some of which I think don't exist anymore,
Exactly.
but we are constantly in a process of change at the General Electric Company. But the one constant has been Deb's steady progression in her career up, and was appointed an officer of the company, one of our most senior level position in 2006. And expanded her role to include heading up the GE Foundation just last year, the end of last year. She's been a fabulous, fabulous partner, I can tell you, to the government affairs function here in Washington. And I think you probably have more biographical information, so I won't continue to go on, but suffice it to say, we are always delighted to have her down in DC, and particularly delighted to have her here today. So thanks very much, Deb.
Thank you. Good morning. Oh, that was kind of weak now, wasn't it? I mean, really, come on. Good morning. Good morning. First of all, let me just say I'm very pleased to be here to talk about a topic that I think is very important. And just to give a few remarks, I want to thank Karan, for my friend and colleague, for his very generous introduction, and Julia and Nikki for the things you're going to talk about as we get into the topic. But as Karan said, I've been with GE. It's actually, I hit 27 years a couple of weeks ago. And taking this role on the foundation piece in October has been particularly enriching as I'm focusing now on some of the things we're going to talk about. You know, I've been asked to just give a few remarks, and I think we want to get into the data, so I will be very brief, about how GE thinks about impact investing. You know, impact investing. That's a big word. It's a very meaningful word for us. Really, what sets GE apart is how we combine investment dollars with people, with process, and with technology to drive sustainability. And I think that's a differentiator, and we've been able to leverage that sort of framework with the Partners for Democratic Change over the last several years. You know, when you really think about impact capital, you know, your dollars, and you tie it with skill-based volunteering, you really can have a big impact. I'll give you a local example that's a little closer to home. One of the things the GE Foundation focuses on quite a bit is health. And we've had health centers, primary health centers across the US that we funded and supported. So the place where you would go, so you don't go to an emergency room, you would go here. Now what's interesting is part of the deal for accepting our check is that you've got to accept our skilled-based volunteers. many of whom are ethnically diverse. And the clientele they serve often are diverse in a way that the volunteers look like them. So part of it is going in not just to paint, but to say, how do we help you with patient flow? How do we use Lean Six Sigma? How do we use some of the skills and innovation that we would use at GE in our day jobs to support a community and to have sustainability in that space? So similar kind of concept. So when we talked about partnering with the Partners for Democratic Change and what they were about, it made a lot of sense for us. We think about their work with social entrepreneurs and the centers that they've developed and the centers that they build and sustain. And Karan talked about a few specific examples that GE's been able to utilize. But I think teaching those critical skills of negotiating for a win-win, and leadership development, that's what helps you sustain in emerging economies where we need to work, we need to do business. It's one thing to have an answer for something, to give someone an answer. When I was a kid and I said, what does this word mean, Mommy? And my mother would say, well, you should look it up. You should look it up and write it down. That was a lot more meaningful for me to develop my own answer, my own meaning for the word. I was able to retain that than her just saying, oh, it means this. And so I think that's what the Partners for Democratic Change have really been about, developing a framework and enabling a culture through these centers around the world that help local leaders have the skill set, have the ability to develop change and create the kind of environments that we need everywhere. The study that we've done is very important to us, that we've supported, I should say, and it'll be talked about, because we like data. One of my former colleagues used to always say, look at the dollar bill, in God we trust, but all others bring data. And data is important to us because we want to understand that where we are investing, that it really did work. We want to understand, well, what worked about it so that it can be replicated. And again, that's why this partnership is so meaningful for us, because the study gives us that kind of information so that we can feel very comfortable that our impact capital is being put to great use. So I'm going to pause there and turn it over to the next speakers, I think, who'll get into a lot more of the data, and then I'll be happy to take your questions when we get into that piece. Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here.
Good morning, everyone. Can you hear me? I might stand up at some point, and I asked for a lavalier because I like to move around to keep me awake, to keep you awake. So let me just get started. My name is Veronica Octavia Hella Maria Dertinger Karstaffen, but you can call me Nika. So how did we get here today? I'm swimming in data, so I'm going to try to condense it as best as possible and make it meaningful for all of you here. Let me just introduce myself and say a few words before I get into that data. First of all, I was basically hired by Julia almost 3 years ago to start this journey of a 3-year global evaluation to look at what Partners has been doing since they were founded in 1989 by Raymond Schonholz. And that was a pretty big endeavor. So the process that we used was a participatory process, and basically spent the year 2011 talking with all of the center directors, some of their staff, the staff here at Partners, the board, some academics, and basically had 5 different design workshops to try to figure out, well, how can we do this evaluation to look at such a long history of work, given that the various organizations that Partners has created started at different points in time, in different contexts, some doing similar and also different kinds of work. How do we evaluate this? I'm still not sure. But anyway, I will share with you what we did discover. I want to thank Julia, first of all, for having the confidence in me to do this, and for Nick, who really was instrumental in kind of refining some of the final data analysis and writing to present to you the report, as well as the members of the board, many of whom are here. But most of all, I really want to thank the center directors and their staff, and for any of you who are watching, listening, hello out there around the world, because without them, none of this would have happened. They spent a lot of time answering a lot of questions in surveys, in interviews, in Skype, in email, and so on. And it's really their legacy that I'm going to be discussing today. So thank you. I'm basically going to kind of touch on three different points. One is just a little bit more about what does partners mean by sustainable impact investment. And then looking at, well, if we're trying to do sustainable impact investing and having the centers who are now part of that legacy, looking at, well, what made them sustainable? What was partners' role in helping them become sustainable, and what were their own strategies and approaches to becoming sustainable? And then, so what? You know, so you have all these organizations and all these people running around doing whatever, so what? So we're gonna look a little bit about some of the kinds of outcomes and results that the organizations are achieving and have achieved, are achieving, and will continue to achieve long into the future. So that's basically what we're going to cover today. I just realized
Matt, can you just come up and
I just realized I don't have a clicker.
Matt.
So yeah, that will be perfect. Thank you.
Oh, sorry.
There you are.
Okay. All right. So what do we mean by investing in local organizations? You know, I don't know how many of you know the history, but I'll just go into it very briefly. But basically, Raymond Schonholz, who was an expert in conflict management through his experience with the community boards in San Francisco, setting up community-based mediation centers in San Francisco and really leading that effort all throughout the United States many years ago. And after a couple of decades of doing that work, he was looking around for other things to maybe get involved in, and it just so happened in 1989, we know what happened in Central and Eastern Europe, the fall of the wall, and he went to Eastern Europe on a Fulbright scholarship and realized in looking around that of all these opportunities, now that the wall has fallen, what are some of the challenges that all of these countries are going to have in the wake of communism? And one of the things that he noticed, amongst many things, is that there was a gap in the ability of society and government to actually address the enormous transition process that they were undertaking, and how to manage all of the conflicts that were suddenly erupting and were going to inevitably erupt as change occurs. And so he decided this is an opportune time for me to take all of my experience that I developed working with community mediation centers and mediation in other venues and bringing that to Central and Eastern Europe. He was not alone in that endeavor. There were many organizations also flooding into Central and Eastern Europe saying, oh, we want to help society develop, we want to help the governments, and so on. And one of the things that Ray said that was distinguished what his approach was with what he considered some of the many of the other approaches is that he saw a flood of people going in doing training that was primarily short-term. Let's train a lot of people, which makes sense. You know, if you feel like people need skills, let's go and train people, help them learn how to do conflict management, how do you engage with civil society, those kinds of things. So training made sense, except what he thought was lacking was a long-term commitment to those countries and to the people that were being trained, and that when people's projects and organizations' projects were over, people left, and while they left a lot of trained people, there was no institutions that were left that were able to carry on the legacy of that work. And so his idea was basically to invest not only in people, but also in institutions. And so looking at yes, training with local partners is key because they're the ones who have an investment in their own long-term future. But you want to work with individuals, and you also want to work with institutions, not only the existing institutions, because a lot of people were doing that in terms of working with existing government structures and existing organizations, but what is this thing called civil society? That was a new concept at the time. And so he was saying that for democracy to flourish, you need not only effective government, but you also need effective civil society and an effective business sector. So those cross-sectoral relationships is what he wanted to build, working with individuals and institutions. The other thing, based on his own conflict management background, is the notion that you have to do all of this in a very participatory, inclusive, collaborative way, which is very different than the top-down approach that was common under communism. A whole new way of thinking about how you make plans, how you make budgets, how you pass laws, how you decide how to resolve the issues, whether it's neighbors' conflicts or issues between majority and minority groups or between countries, especially as many of these folks were descending into civil war. What do you do? How do you do this? Because all they knew about in the past was suppression and oppression. So bringing new skills and change in conflict management. The other thing he recognized is that as an outsider himself, and trying to build local capacity, that endeavor would be strengthened by having an international network of like-minded professionals who are facing similar challenges, so that they can share with each other their own best practices, their challenges, and how they've overcome those challenges. So those were kind of the three basic principles of what Partners was founded on. And through the evaluation, we were kind of trying to look at, okay, these were sort of initial hypotheses, and can we kind of test these? And we didn't test these in the traditional evaluation research sense, because for a lot of reasons, which we can talk about in questions and answer. But basically, through the research, we did show that those initial three kind of ideas or hypotheses were in fact valid and continue to be valid to this day. So I don't know for sure exactly when Ray first started using the term social impact investment. He's used it different ways over time. But basically, he was trying to apply the ideas of social entrepreneurship to institutional platforms, so building sustainable social entrepreneurs and sustainable institutional platforms. And so it's the combination of those two, which is similar to some of the things that Deborah was saying earlier about, the finances and the people and the process, and so on. So I think that syncs up very nicely. Just a little bit of background of the approaches that he took to sustainable impact investing. When he initially went into Central and Eastern Europe, as I said, NGOs, civil society, what's that? And people had some inkling of that, and there were some. It's not as if they didn't exist at all, but there was a lot of distrust and confusion about the role of NGOs and civil society. And so his initial strategy was to work with prestigious universities in the capitals of various countries that he was working in, because they had prestige and clout and credibility and legitimacy. So the initial strategy was to work with these institutions, work with these universities, develop curriculum, bring all these new concepts into the universities, do training not only with students but also with government leaders and at the local and national level, civil society leaders at the local and national level. And so education and training was the initial entree. After a couple of years of doing training, and more training and more training, a lot of the center directors were saying, training is not enough. We want to also do intervention. And so they started taking their own skills that they had developed, because some of these skills were very new for the center directors as well. But now that they had confidence in those skills that they had been training others in, they were ready to mediate themselves. And so setting up mediation centers was one of the things, one of the initial forms of intervention. And then looking around at some of the conflicts that people were facing, for example, relations between different ethnic groups. Roma being one of the prime groups that was a minority group all throughout Europe. And there are a lot of minority-majority relationships there. And after the fall of communism, Roma became even more unequal in society in terms of employment and income and education and so on. And so there were a lot of the centers decided that they wanted to work on what they at the time called ethnic reconciliation integration, using the mediation model, and they called it conciliation, to address some of the concerns that the Roma minority had. That was working well. They got a lot of grant funding at the time. During this university model, donors were very keen on funding projects such as the education and training, such as Roma reintegration, such as mediation. And partners used that funding to underwrite the development of the centers themselves. But it was project-based funding used to try to also do organizational development, institutional capacity building. But as these centers started doing more and more intervention work, the universities kind of said, we're not too sure about this, because they didn't want to become politicized, and they were afraid that doing intervention work would potentially harm them in some way. And at the same time, the center directors wanted to be more entrepreneurial, going back to some of GE's interests in all of this. And the university structure was too bureaucratic to enable that. So basically, Ray said, and the center's directors themselves, who were around at that time, said, maybe we need a new model. And so at that point, they decided that developing separate, independent, autonomous NGOs registered locally, not field offices of partners, but local, autonomous, independent organizations, was the next wave of center development. So initially working with the existing centers that were housed in the universities, inviting them, the directors there, to become the directors of the new NGOs. About half the directors said, yes, sounds like a great idea, and helped form these new NGOs, and the rest remained in the university or did other things. So the initial ones that were housed in the university all became NGOs, in addition to the new completely expansion into new countries and new regions with the addition of Mexico and Peru. So what initially started off in Central and Eastern Europe, Ray and the centers realized, there's other places around the world that could use some of these same processes and same tools. They weren't necessarily dealing with exactly the same kinds of issues, but they were having their own challenges with democratic transitions. During the NGO model, what was great is that the donors, funders, were very interested in actually building institutions, which is what made this possible, because without funding, it would have been hard to do this. And partners in the centers were able to get 2 to 3 years of funding to start up each of the centers and actually for institution building. So we went from project-driven funding to institution building-driven funding that also supported project work, kind of the reverse. That worked well until 2007, and then 2008 rolled around, and the climate was different. Donor interests changed. They were still interested in the kind of work that Partners was doing, but they weren't interested in creating new organizations, but they were perfectly happy to work with existing organizations. And so through the help of General Electric Foundation, they created the Sustainable Leadership Program, with the idea being that we can use a cohort approach to kind of scale up and speed up the process of center development. Prior to this, centers have been developed about an average of 1 a year. And the hope was that maybe we can start up 3 centers at the same time and train them together in Washington for a month, and then provide ongoing support to them when they go back to their respective countries. And that worked well to a certain extent too, and as partners found in their own internal evaluation of the Sustainable Leadership Program, that also had its challenges. And part of the conclusion was that NGO model with 2 to 3 years of really nice funding for a long-term projects from multiple donors was really the ideal sweet spot for creating stability. The downside of what happened with this Sustainable Leadership Program, or the challenge is that the directors felt a lot of pressure to hurry up and get funding to sustain themselves. And so they were trying to do a lot of growth while they were still building their skills and individual capacity and organizational capacity. So there was a tension between that. And a lot of changes have been made to the program since then to marry the best of both worlds, the NGO model, the Sustainable Leadership Program, and experiences from previous centers. So from 1991 to 2001, there were 22 centers created, and the 4 in red left the network. So that's 18 out of 22 centers that still survive and thrive, meaning that it's a success rate of 82%, which is, when I first asked the centers, when we started the process of designing the evaluation, I said, how do you measure, how would you define success? And the first thing, almost the first thing almost everyone said was, we still exist. And I thought, well, that doesn't sound very impressive. Until I actually went into the literature, I'm like, well, how many NGOs do exist after they've been around an average of 10 or more years, which is what the average is of all the centers. And I found that, different articles, different research slices it different ways, but basically anywhere from 33% survive beyond 5 years to 55% fail within the first year. So somewhere between 33% and 50% survive. And that's just, the first 5 years, not 10 years. And then I compared it to how about the for-profit industry, and the service industry there is, the service industry, which is most similar to partners, is 55% still operating after 4 years. And then the figures go down even worse if I actually look at NGO survival rates in the countries where these where these organizations are. So they were right. That was actually a pretty impressive figure. So how did we achieve that? And here's really the meat of what I want to get to is how did they achieve that kind of a success rate? What are some of the key factors? One of the things that I think one of the big things that I realized, and I think in conversation with everybody that we realized, is how the relationship between partners and the centers evolved over time. And it's within that evolution that I think is part of the success. Because if you go back to what I said at the very beginning, in terms of Ray looked around in 1989 and saw a lot of donors coming in, a lot of international organizations coming in, doing short-term training, or setting up field offices. That was, the other typical pattern, setting up field offices that are directed from San Francisco, DC, New York, or wherever. And his approach was, well, but we want local autonomous NGOs. And so the notion of, well, what does it really mean when he says, we want local partners, we want to develop local partners? And on the one hand, it's supposed to be independent, autonomous organizations. And on the other hand, organizations were dependent on partners for their initial funding, for their initial training and skills that he was bringing to them, and that subsequent, trainers, other international experts brought to them. So there was, on the one hand, saying, ooh, we're partners, at the same time there was some dependency. And so I found some interesting articles on this, about this notion of authentic partnerships. Alan Fowler, for example, basically says that for Western NGOs to develop true partnerships with local partners, they need to have trust-based, mutually enabling, equitable relationships, as opposed to basically funding-based, and the assumption that all of the information and all of the capacity building and all of everything is one way from us to them kind of approach, or top-down, and with these local partners being recipients, basically, of all of our wisdom. And that if, as long as that's the case, then it's not an what he calls an authentic partnership. It's a partnership, but it's not equitable. So the notion that how do you then build those authentic partnerships, which then requires that building a center, building an organization, doing capacity building with individuals and institutions is not a short-term project. It's a commitment to what Partners has made so far, a lifelong partnership. All right, so let's look a little bit more about that. So one of the things that the centers were very interested in and that Partners was very interested in is what are the stages of development? If we're trying to build these sustainable, mature organizations, what can we say about how they start up, how they grow, how they mature? And there, you know, there's pretty typical stages that organizations go through. What's not on here is stage 4, which is kind of either stagnation and reinvention, or stagnation and decline, and they go out of business. What we were really interested in is, you know, how did they get from startup or incubation to maturity and sustainability? And we looked at the role of partners, and we looked at what the center's directors and staff themselves did in terms of developing their organization and the human resources that they have. What financial strategies did they have to become financially independent, and what were the programs and services, and how did they adapt and innovate in order to stay relevant? And what you'll see in this chart, what I'm trying to show in this, is the shift in the relationship between partners, which is that top row, and the centers, which is the next 3 rows, goes from, okay, yeah, when the centers first started, there is kind of a patron type of relationship with partners bringing the funding, the capacity building, and so on. But as the centers themselves are kind of in that dreaming, what can we do? What is our niche? Where can we go? What's our value added? What's our strength? But they're dependent financially, and and many of them, at least in the first wave of a lot of the centers, were basically acculturating, taking Western methodologies and adapting them to their own local contexts. That was kind of, in general, the incubation stage. And so that inevitably is an unequal relationship. But as the centers mature, and they are successful with their projects, they're successful in building their staff, they're successful in building relationships with each other, and I'll talk more about that in a moment. So relationships internally within the network and the other centers, and externally with local organizations, government, both local, national, international relationships with donors and funders in their own right. As they develop all of those, through their growth stage, it both feeds their growth and enables their growth, and eventually becoming mature and sustainable in the way that organizations typically become mature and sustainable. But once they reach that stage, the relationship has shifted because they're no longer financially dependent on partners. They can say, goodbye, I don't need to listen to you. We are autonomous, independent organizations, just like you wanted us to be. Thanks. We're going to go on our way. So why didn't they go on their way? Because Partners was able, and it wasn't an easy transition, but Partners was able to work with the center directors, slowly listen to their needs and expectations about a shifting relationship, and respond. And that was really critical. So as the centers matured, they wanted a more egalitarian, authentic partnership. And as partners matured, because partners had to go through its own maturation process, it was also more open and able and willing and figuring out how to do that effectively and live up to their own ideals. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the role of partners and some of the key things that they did along the way and how some of these shifted as the centers became more and more mature. First of all, one of the key challenges and key successes was just finding the right leaders, the right social entrepreneurs to invest in the first place. The 4 centers that failed that I showed you earlier, the key reason they failed was because they didn't have the right director. And in some places, partners, like for Russia, for example, I was told, I tried to follow up all these people who were in the failed centers and could not find anybody, so I was using Google Translate to try to read articles. Anyway, long process. But one of the stories that one of the other center directors told me was, for example, with Russia, there were 3 different directors that Ray tried. And they all failed within, and basically after a couple of years, he just gave up and said, we can't pick the right director, maybe it's just not the right time to be here, and so on. And part of that, I think, from talking with center directors was, again, part of partners and Ray's and the rest of the staff and board at the time, their own maturation process and becoming more culturally aware and culturally sensitive and being able to figure out who is speaking honestly and who is really just using partners to make contacts in the West to open up a popcorn business, I was told one person did. Well, but at least that was a couple of new jobs opened, so I don't know, who am I to criticize? Finding the right social entrepreneur as the center director. But once that was in place, one of the big things that people said was really important was just the brand recognition and the credibility and legitimacy that came with being affiliated with partners. The center director said that was very helpful in their incubation stage when they're brand new organizations and especially for those directors who didn't already have their own track record running or working with NGOs. So that was really important for them personally to develop that credibility and legitimacy. And it was also important to the donors that I spoke with, that it gave them the confidence to invest in these new organizations, either invest in the projects that they were expected to run or invest in building these organizations. Having partners and this network, and I failed to mention that in 2006, partners and the centers actually formalized the relationship between all of these centers and partners, and opened up a secretariat in Brussels in 2006, and Partners for Democratic Change International. And part of that was to build on the center-to-center work that was starting to occur, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. But it was also going back to the notion of building that authentic partnership, is that was one of the ways that some of the center directors at the time felt like the relationship could become more equitable. They saw having a secretariat in Brussels as balancing this big powerhouse in Washington, D.C. We'll have more representation. But brand recognition, credibility, legitimacy was especially important during the startup phase, but everybody said that it continues to be important, that being affiliated with partners and the Partners for Democratic Change International network starts to have cachet and is something that they market on their websites and in their brochures and in a lot of their other marketing materials. And so that is an ongoing benefit that people see, even beyond their initial startup phase. Financial resources, marketing, business development, I already talked about. Obviously, then a year, 2, 3 years of funding is critical for the startup. But what they actually said was even more important was the coaching and marketing and business development that partners did in collaboration with the center directors. So rather than just going out and getting funding, which they did at the beginning, again, it wasn't always authentic. But as the centers matured, as partners matured, they realized we need to do this in partnership. So going with center directors to meet with donors and then helping them, for example, write the proposal afterward, negotiate contracts, coaching them on how you do this, especially for those directors who'd never done this before and were expected to raise their own funds. So that became very important, and today is one of the key things that people still expect. Even the most mature, sustainable organizations are still looking to partners to help them with ongoing marketing of them individually and the network as a whole. Training and capacity building, obviously, going back to some of the first things I said about the capacity building of individuals and institutions. So training and capacity building in terms of the changing conflict management skills and in typical organizational development skills such as financial management and how do you create a board in countries where they don't have boards of directors or boards of advisors. What does that mean? What's their role? So everything from the organizational development to the actual technical skills that they were using to actually do the projects that they were doing. Jointly managing programs and working on regional and joint initiatives. As the centers matured and had more and more capacity and skills, partners partnered with the organizations to work on joint projects. So instead of just funding them and running the project and having them help partners run the project, it became flipped, where partners then is contracting the centers to lead projects or work in collaboration with them. What also happened as the centers became more mature is that they started working more together with each other in partnerships. And that became actually after people were in 6, 7, 8 years old, that became the most important piece of what the network brought to them, is the opportunity to work together with other centers, especially on regional initiatives. The networking, bridge building, and catalyst for collaboration, again, that's internally in the network and then externally with donors and partners, was key in what, partners, although there's a secretariat in Brussels, partners here in DC is still basically providing the leadership for the network because it has the expertise, it has the resources, and so on. And so has played that role also with introducing folks to donors and other organizations and so on. And that piece is, part of what the centers really value because working with each other has become so important. So access to other centers is one of the key value added that they see as being affiliated with partners. And I think the last thing I'll just touch on is this notion of accompaniment. And this goes actually right to the definition of authentic partnerships from the way that Partners does this. And what it basically means is that they're accompanying the organizations every step of the way. How they accompany changes as the centers mature. So the accompanying initially is we're providing capacity building, we're helping you, fundraise for you, and teaching you how we do that along the way, to accompaniment in terms of moral support. For those who are mature and sustainable, they don't need the other kind of support, but they like having the moral support, somebody they can bat around new ideas with. Oh, we're thinking about doing this, or we're thinking about doing that. What do you think? So a partnership of peers that they also, are developing with each other.
Nika, you have about 15 minutes.
So I'm not going to go into detail with these next 3 categories because it's the typical kinds of things that organizations do for themselves that I'm going to assume that most of you are familiar with in terms of having the proper leadership and governance structure, professionalizing and the staff, and as they grow, organizations tend to specialize, having an infrastructure, IT systems, policies, procedures, et cetera. I think the key thing here is the marketing and the leveraging of success. As they started having successes, for example, at the local level with local mediation centers and local intervening successfully in local cases, getting visibility and the cachet to be able to do that more at the national level, and eventually at the regional level within their own region. And many of the organizations are now actually working internationally. So for example, Poland went from specializing in family mediation and other interpersonal kind of mediation to doing training and international development internationally as an implementing partner for the government of Poland. Taking skills that they developed in one area and applying it and leveraging it in another area. The financial strategies, everybody, no matter how mature and sustainable, says financial sustainability is still an ongoing concern for the same reasons that it is for every other organization out there. For the European organizations, they went through two crises, one in 2004 with the accession to the EU, which cut off US funding, and the EU hadn't kind of caught up to providing funding yet, and then with the 2008 financial collapse hurting everyone. So everybody had to engage in a lot of strategies, initially anyway to grow and mature, but then also to weather these crises. And this is where Partners also comes in very important, because Partners has been able to provide a financial safety net for organizations. And that right there might be one of the reasons that some of these organizations still exist, because not a lot of individual organizations, unless they have an angel investor or a wealthy board, have access to those kinds of resources. So Partners has either provided loans or done an extra bit of business development and marketing to help the center survive. So what? So they're here. What are they doing? Are they promoting democratic change, and with what kind of results? One of the key things for them to achieve democratic change goes back to the notion that process matters, back to one of Ray's founding principles that you need participatory, inclusive, collaborative skills. And that's really the crux of what distinguishes the centers, is they've developed strong change and conflict management skills that they've used in one niche area, and then they pay attention to what their context is, and as the country changes, as the environment changes, they've been able to adapt the skills that they used in one area to another. So for example, mediation. Mediation was something that pretty much all of the centers in Central Eastern Europe started off with, doing mediation in the schools, for example, mediation in the universities. Now it's mediation in the court system, because that was a big gap. Then it's mediation in prisons, mediation in for juveniles on probation, mediation to address interethnic issues. So using the skills in one substantive area and applying it to other substantive area. The other thing that they realized was that training is great, again, but the intervention is really great. And then even after the intervention and a lot of the mediation at the interpersonal level, or setting up mediation systems and mediation laws to support mediation, they realized they came to recognize that a lot of the issues that they were addressing were not negotiable or mediatable in the traditional sense. There wasn't a specific issue. People were still trying to actually define what the issue is. And so the notion of facilitating multi-stakeholder dialogues with civil society, business, government, looking at big issues, climate change, pollution, how to manage water, how to address conflicts around the extractive industry. How do you do economic development and environmental sustainability. So getting into much more comprehensive, large-scale, multi-stakeholder processes. But because they were process experts, they were able to use the fundamental skills that they had and apply it in new areas. All right, so I've already kind of covered some of these. All of the, one of the fun things that I realized in the talking with the directors and looking at what they've accomplished is the number of firsts that they brought to their countries, and that's one of the things I think that helped them become visible and then build their reputation and credibility and legitimacy was just the sheer number of the firsts that they brought. So for example, the ones in Europe, mediation, for many of them in their countries, they were the first ones to actually introduce mediation into the criminal justice system, for example. Helping draft laws to legitimize mediation in the country, helping create mediation associations, completely new ideas and institutionalizing it. So going way beyond just training to institutionalizing these new practices. Let me just. So good governance, so civil society development, good governance is the bulk of what the centers do. Well over, let me back up just one moment. One of the ways that we were design the research is using something called most significant change stories. For those of you who aren't familiar with that, we basically asked all of the centers to submit up to 5 stories of what they considered were their most significant changes or results that they had achieved, and to describe that in as much detail as they could. And I had a series of questions that they answered. And from that, I looked at what they themselves said as their most significant change and kind of categorized that into different thematic areas. So one of which is civil society development, good governance, promoting inclusive societies, promoting economic development and environmental sustainability, promoting participation, the connection between civil society and government. Governance, of course, covers everyone, but the connection between civil society and government. And so this is what comes from those stories, is that the majority of what they said were their most successful outcomes were with civil society development, good governance, conflict management and access to justice, inclusive societies, and so on. I just wanted to give you just a little taste of some of these, and during the question and answer, you can, if you're interested in hearing more stories, I can give you that. But for example, with the multi-stakeholder dialogues, cooperative advocacy, and participatory budgeting, for example, a lot of the countries from Jordan to Georgia to Albania and so on, Peru, having citizens work with local government or municipal governments to come up with their budgets. The concept of having government actually listen to what are the priorities of the people was a completely new thing. So working together to do participatory budgeting is a new thing that many people brought and that people were seeing concrete results on, because they were seeing government and civil society actually changing the way they interact, changing the way they do business, and in many cases, and more cases, institutionalizing that beyond the life of the project. So not only did they do participatory budgeting while the center directors were leading it, but they were keeping it going after the center director left. And that's a key thing. And that's also a key challenge. Not everybody has been able to do that, to institutionalize that. And that's where, in my recommendations, that was one of the areas that I said need to talk more about how do you institutionalize these changes, so they do really carry on, not just how partners create sustainable local institutions, but how do those local institutions create sustainable local new institutions and practices. It's the same. Doing election monitoring, for example, in Albania for the first time without external support. It was a huge undertaking, hundreds of thousands of people involved, a lot of training, support, and really making that transition and giving the country the ability and civil society the ability to trust their own elections. I mentioned the ethnic conciliation commissions in Bulgaria and Hungary and Slovakia, Czech Republic. That was one of the key ways initially that the centers got started, got visible, got funding, and left a legacy of these commissions that are, many of which are still operating today. Same thing with the mediation centers, 50 plus, mediation centers in those various countries that are still working, the institutionalizing them into local and national government. So inclusive societies, some of the interesting work, for example, in Yemen, working with women in tribal areas being largely forgotten by the NGO, the international NGO world, because it was hard to access. And that's one of the conundrums always in development work, is we tend to focus on the people who are easy to access. And they saw the gap and were able to work with local women to do leadership training, for example. And I can talk a little bit more about that if you want, because they had to be very culturally sensitive in order to make that happen. How do you work with the men and the women in order to do women's empowerment? New processes, new concepts, new ways of doing things that is actually changing local cultures and expectations, and in some cases, gender roles are being discussed. So while Partners started its work with some notions about we need change in conflict management skills, and we need participation and collaboration, there was really no unifying theory of change that encapsulated all of the center's work. And when I first asked the different centers and partners, what's your theory of change? Mostly I got a lot of blank stares, which is not surprising, because that the language around theory of change, or basically the assumptions on how we think X is going to lead to Y, is still relatively actually new in our own in the development field. But going back to Anthony Giddens, who wrote a very nice book on the theory of structuration, basically talks about the interplay between changing social agents and social structures, and that if you change social agents, i.e. people, that can lead to changes in social structures, and if you change social structures, that can also lead to changes in people. And that's actually, when we kind of looked at it and stepped back from it, it's like, that actually kind of describes what Partners does. And looking at the stories that they submitted about their most significant change, and then asking them outright directly, what is your theory of change, and kind of trying to elicit that, we kind of came up with, we're moving towards a unifying theory of change, that the assumption that if you change attitudes, build skills, and bring people together in relationships, and you build social structures and provide those participatory platforms for dialogue and mediating structures, then if you do both of those, change towards whatever goal will happen. And some variation of that is true for basically all of the most significant change stories, and I got 55 of them, that fit into that same pattern. What's important about that is it also is similar to, and this might be familiar to some of you, the Reflecting on Peace Practice program from the CDA Collaborative Associates did a years-long research on focusing on peace writ large, and how do we create peace at the national level, which is a little bit different than what Partners focuses on. But when I talked with the center directors and we talked about this model, it kind of made sense to them. So I thought, well, let's try to see if this can help explain Partners theory of change. And basically what it's saying is what they found, that all of the activities, all the projects, all the programs that organizations are doing that they think is contributing to peace can be broken down along two dimensions. Are they addressing more people or key people? Key people being the decision makers, leaders, and so on. Are they trying to do the attitude change and skills and behavior change at the individual personal level? Or are they focused at the socio-political change level, those structures and institutions, policies, and practices? And that along those two dimensions, and there are 4 quadrants, and that they could, basically categorize every project or program in there. And so in looking at what the centers described as their own theories of change and their most significant change stories, we found that of the most significant stories they submitted, that that they also kind of fit into this pattern. Let me just describe, before I go further, what the arrows mean. The main takeaway from this is that it's not enough to do work at just the individual personal level, changing attitudes, individual behaviors, nice, but not sufficient, at least not in their experience. Maybe if you have 50 years and you're talking about generational slow change, that might have a significant difference. But basically, they said the most significant projects is when you connect that change at the local level, skills, attitudes, behaviors, to the social political level. And in fact, the stories that the centers submitted, the majority of them, 91% of them, made that connection. So now I don't know what all the other things that they've been doing, all the other projects, programs they've been doing, how they would fall here. But when they themselves describe their most significant changes, it matches the assumption that if you connect the individual level to the socio-political level, that's going to be significant change. And their stories match that. Same thing with the many people, or they say more people and key people, that at the social-political level, it's not enough to have the leaders sign a peace agreement. That happens all the time. And they either keep it or don't keep it, or the people support it or don't support it. So the notion that you have to have the masses, basically, and key decision makers, and key decision makers could also be spoilers, the people who ruin things. They might not be in government or key decision makers, but they can ruin things, and that makes them key for creating peace. The same thing with, and the same concepts apply in trying to build democracy and democratic change, that you have to connect many people and key people. And in fact, the most significant change stories showed that 75% of the outcomes and projects that they described explicitly made the connection between not only changing many people, but also key people, or vice versa. Sometimes they started with decision makers and then used a media campaign, for example, to raise public awareness and change public opinion about what was going on based on what they were doing with decision makers, or vice versa.
Nika, I think we have to wrap up.
Okay.
I don't think we can do Mexico. We only have 15 minutes.
Okay. So I was going to show you this nice theory of change in action, but we can talk about that later. So I'm going to just stop there and let Julia kind of wrap this up.
And take questions. I hate cutting Nika off, because this is a very specific case study that in your document you can read more about. It's talked in more detail. And I'm actually going to save my closing remarks for when we actually close. Just really would like to thank Nika, obviously to thank GE as well for their investment in, an organization like us. What a luxury to spend 3 years looking at our work and thinking about it. And it's just been a tremendous journey that Nika's been a lovely partner on. But, we've got a lot of really great people in the room that I know you've got some thoughts about this, the role of international NGOs, the role of local capacity building, how you contribute to democracy and peace and democratic change. So we only have about 15 minutes. I'm not sure if we have a microphone to give you, but if not, I'll repeat the question. Andy, and then here in front, go ahead.
One of the real challenges of sustainability of organizations domestically is what's sometimes called founder's disease. How do you move past an initial founder? And so I wonder, of the 82% that have survived, how many have you been able to get past that first really dynamic social entrepreneur with to a more professionalized, non-personalized organization?
Great. Nika, shall I let just two questions and then we'll answer them? Go ahead. Would you like to ask your question? It'd be helpful if you want to introduce yourself. That was Andy Blum from USIP.
Stephen Salyer, Salzburg Global Seminar. First of all, just compliments. I think, looking at yourselves and trying to tease out what the really important elements are over time, I think is really commendable, and looking forward to looking at the report in more depth that you've created. Question is this, a new study out from BBC Action talks about the role of media in fragile states, and I know in your report you're talking about media strategies as being important elements at key moments along the way. And I know from past experience that an organization like GE really appreciates this and has been courageous in investing also in media strategies, even though sometimes in local context those can be controversial. And the problem that BBC Action points out is that in so many states, the ability to have a forum in which contending groups or different points of view can be expressed is on the decline as media is becoming more fractionalized. And yet media as an issue doesn't seem to be getting much attention in being addressed. The role of media platforms that do allow for there to be inclusive conversation about the future of a state. So the question is, how are you seeing that variable as part of your larger strategy? And do you think there are particular strategies that are going to be important to focus more attention on in the future in order to make the democratic conversation possible?
Thank you. Maybe we'll take one more question and then answer. Go ahead. Oh, well, we'll take both of them, Chip, and then go.
Hi, Chip House from the Alliance for Peace Building, and the comments from the two folks from GE and a conversation I had with Jonathan before we started prompted thinking, which is always dangerous. And I have two friends who wrote a book on defeating post-communist authoritarian leaders through elections, in which they drew a lot on your folks in their research. And when they presented the book at their launch, Val Bunce, the closer friend, talked about the importance of NGOs, probably because I was there. And I got kind of upset because I don't think we deserve that kind of credit. But as we talked, and this is the question that I can't really answer myself, we came back to partners because you make a longer-term investment on the ground in developing infrastructure, a term I probably wouldn't use, but yeah, it's good enough. And I guess the takeaway I took from the report is the importance of that. And I think maybe the question is really for the folks from GE, why is that important to you, the sort of long-term sustainable investment in this kind of work? Because it's not intuitively obvious to all of the AFP members that you should be doing that, both long-term and developing capacity on the ground.
Thank you. Thank you, Chip. And the last question.
Hi, Annette Brown with the International Initiative for Impact Evaluation. So I think a lot of us in the room have also been involved with a variety of organizations that have been tasked by donors and other international parties over the last 20 years to do similar kinds of work, that is to build civil society organizations in the former Soviet Union and Eastern Europe, and also more broadly in low and middle income countries. And so, I'm guessing, 'cause the question is on my mind and probably on other people's mind, is trying to understand a little bit more of the comparative aspect. The list of features that you put up there are all things that we were tasked with doing by our organizations, by our donors, when we were involved in trying to build civil society organizations. And so those things look very familiar. But the success rate, I think, again, I would want to compare to similar kinds of organizations, but does look very, very good. And so my question is, what are the 2 or 3 things, if you had to pick 2 or 3 things that really stand out, that are different about Partners' approach or Partners' implementation over this period that can help us explain why the success rate for Partners has really been that much better than what we think it probably is for this kind of work in general?
Thank you very much. So, Nico, do you want to talk about the founder's disease and then maybe your thoughts on the comparison across countries?
Yeah. So I don't remember now the exact numbers of directors who left. I think it's about half now, and that was one of the points of crisis for a couple of the centers, was when their very strong, vibrant, well-connected, well-respected founder left. Fortunately, that person didn't leave completely, because a lot of the founders who left to go on to do other things still stayed connected, either through the board or through consulting or what have you. But that was a challenge, and so far of the 18 centers that are still here with us, I think it was 3, 4, 5 have 5 that I can think of off the top of my head that went through a period of semi-crisis and came out okay. In fact, most recently, that was the organization. There were 2 centers that were in that. Either going to stagnate and decline, or I'm going to stagnate and reinvent myself. And the basic issue that they were addressing was the founder wanted to retire, or go on to other things. And so having a succession plan, which was kind of a new thing, thinking ahead, how do you groom people? And so that was one of the actual areas of advice to Partners, was because some of the centers have gone through this, and Partners has gone through this with the transition from Ray to Julia, is to look at that more explicitly. But so far, that hasn't been the demise of any of the organizations. I mean, when I said the leaders at the beginning, who weren't the right leaders, they didn't have organizations that were thriving to die. They never really got far off the ground to begin with. The question about the last, is that the last question you want me to talk about? I'd say that notion about authentic partnership and the shifting of the relationship between partners and the centers to the centers is one of the key differences that I see. And as I said, it was a difficult transition. But they made it on both sides, and they're still working through some issues. But I think I think moving forward, one of the recommendations and part of the discussion is to do that more explicitly, to think in advance as you're starting new relationships with organizations as Partners expands, is to be more explicit about the understandings of the evolution of the relationship from a financial perspective, from a decision-making perspective, from what's the value added once I've become mature and sustainable? Why should I keep going to Partners meetings and the network meetings? And most of the organizations basically say, well, they actually get something out of the network itself, as I said. So that shifting relationship, though, is, I think, key. The other piece, I think, is the network itself. As I said, as the organizations grow and mature, the center-to-center training and capacity building and support it becomes most important to the centers. And in fact, now, when Partners started, Partners and international experts were brought in to do all the capacity building and training. Now it's the centers with the newest centers. Partners hires another center to provide that training. So then that access to that network of people who know the skills, who know the methodologies, which is the glue that binds them all together, and has some similar shared experiences because of coming from similar context, I think that's the other big key. I'll just stop there.
So maybe Deb wants to take the question about importance for long-term investment.
Yeah, sure, great. Thank you for the question. It's a great question, and I had to sort of, as a career GEer, peel away probably my innate response to be able to articulate it to you. If you think about what GE is about, solving some of the world's toughest problems, that's what we do. Those are our product lines, jet engines that take forever to develop and build, and health industry. Some of those things are a very long cycle. So if you think about that from an impact investment standpoint, I want to ensure that when I invest, that something's going to be there. The last thing I want to do is make an investment in something I think we're going to fix, and maybe we fix it, but 4 years from now, it's unraveling, it's breaking, and then I don't really understand even what we did to fix it. For GEers and our company in particular, which is very process focused, and we talked a lot about process, I want to understand, I'm making the investment, why am I making the investment? Does it work? Okay, not just does it work, but why did it work? What parts of it didn't work? So then I can take that and I can replicate it and I can have it really sustained for a long time. If I think about what Karan talked about in the opening, economies and societies where we want to live, work, and do business, I've got to have sustainable leadership infrastructure in those societies that will allow me to do just that. If I go in with a quick hits may work. It's like a short-term fix versus a long-term fix. So I think the ability to look at investment dollars, impact dollars, combine them with process, combine them with people, combine them with leadership, really is what solves the problem. Solving problems rarely is quick. It's usually longer. So I think the sustainability piece is what's key for me.
Thank you. Excellent. And I got to say, this is why GE is such a great partner for us, because we really think very similarly. And even though they're in this private sector in a completely different mode than we are, this is really what Partners was founded on, this idea of the investment and the slow slog. This is my term. I constantly say, not any one project is going to resolve these problems that we deal with. And so it's the institutions and the people who are going to still be there in the slow slog of democracy building. So I just wanted to add a couple of thoughts and then address the question about media. Concretely, I've thought about this. Why have partner centers been more sustainable than other institutions that we've all been maybe trying to invest in? And the network is absolutely one. I would not diminish the idea of the moral support that is provided for activists. I mean, these are leaders in their society who are driving change, and it is lonely to be in that position, and you can get tired of being the one pushing the ball up the hill. And it's difficult to be the head of an organization because you're fundraising and your board is a problem. And so just even the camaraderie and the moral support, not from DC, but between Argentina and Mexico, or however those organic networks have evolved, are really important, and I think have sustained just even their courage to continue. And the other thing that I would say is, because Partners has a mission around process, they've been able to adapt over and over and over again. So if I was applying my process expertise to child rights for 5 years, and then that we can kind of declare success because that coalition got the policy and that's great. Well, maybe there's a new thing. Maybe I should be thinking about social entrepreneurship or local philanthropy, and I need a new coalition. And so there's been a lot of adaptation. We would think about it as just being very entrepreneurial. What's next? But because I'm known as a process expert and not a substantive expert, I have legitimacy to go back and convene. And so I have new funding relationships, new staff, constant reinvention within these organizations, and they're able to take what worked in Romania. I hope you all picked up the case study about this cool anti-corruption strategy, and I'm going to take that to Georgia, I'm going to take it to Albania, and I've got trainers, I've got experts, I can sell that because I'm a part of a network that has expertise, and that helped sustain them as well. And then finally, just with regards to the media, one thing that just with regards to the changing role of Partners for Democratic Change here is we realize that we also need to be networking with other substantive experts in different areas to bring that capacity and knowledge into the network, and media is absolutely one of those. And so one of our very key partners right now is the Institute for War and Peace Reporting, based in London. We work with them all over the world at this point. And really recognizing that social media in particular is a strategy for the activists that we work with regards to telling the stories and marketing. This is one thing that GE has helped us think about. You actually need to be a little bit more sophisticated in how you tell your story. We're all talking about storytelling right now, right? That's like a buzzword, but it's absolutely true. And so I think how you craft the story about your work and your mission, but how is the story being told about a dialogue? How is the story unfolding about the conflict and the role that it can either be productive or not, is very powerful. And so we're not media experts, but we've been trying to bring that expertise into our work globally. So another round of questions, and then unfortunately we'll have to wrap up. We'll over here.
Daniel Callengard with Freedom House. I'd like to hear a bit more about how the centers have dealt with the big challenge of financial independence, and particularly if you have metrics on the diversity of their funders after they've developed their plan.
Hi, Rick O'Sullivan, Change Management Solutions, and my question dovetails very neatly into yours. Johns Hopkins Center for Civil Society Studies has done research around the world and found that only 12% of nonprofit funding comes from philanthropy or from donors, that the biggest piece is fee-for-service. So I see you have social enterprises, social entrepreneurs as being key. And my question is, and I agree with this totally, but in moving forward, what have you learned about how to identify real social entrepreneurs? What are the characteristics versus someone who's gotten really good at gaming the donor system? Because as you pointed out, that to start off and fund an organization from the get-go and take care of all the bills for 3 years and pay the rent and the staff, and they say that's capacity building. No, that's capacity renting. So how do you, what would you say would be the characteristics of a social entrepreneur that you look for in leadership?
Thank you. Excellent question. And then two over here. Well, we'll do all three, and then.
Keith Kozloff oversees Private Investment Corporation. Two quick questions. One is, I've been reading recently about, with respect to the Arab Spring, undemocratic democratic change. And so my question is, how do you avoid getting pulled into those sorts of situations where there's sort of the veneer of democratic change, but not really the spirit of it? And second, how do the centers sort of market or promote outreach of their services to multinationals like GE, if they're going to be providing, for example, mediation or other related dispute resolution services?
Yeah. Thank you, Keith.
Joan Agerholm. My most recent role was as Deputy Director of the Carnegie Moscow Center, so I'm very comfortable being here because this is my old neighborhood.
Wonderful.
I'm adding another component to this cluster on development and fundraising because it is so crucial for the sustainability of these organizations, and having worked for other similar organizations that face these challenges. And having recently worked in Russia, where a series of NGO laws were passed that are very detrimental to the very existence of many NGOs, and I can say from personal experience, greatly impacted negatively on fundraising opportunities within Russia and perhaps even outside of Russia. My question is, I actually have two small questions. One is with regard to fundraising. There are centers all over the world that Partners has, 18 centers. They are not field offices of Partners, yet they have affiliations, relationships. So when you approach a donor, a large or small donor, whether it's private industry or, say, a Carnegie Corporation of New York, and when they receive applications for funding, what do the donors think? Do they suffer donor fatigue from seeing so many partners-related organizations competing, essentially, for these services? And so my other question then is about for-fee services. Some of these centers offer services, they're semi-private entities. So how do they separate that out from their nonprofit activities? And how do they make that work so that they can be self-sustaining? Thank you.
Great. And then one last question, Dick, if you want to go ahead, right in front of you.
Dick Rosen. I'm with the Council for a Community of Democracies. We have had discussions with partners, and one of the questions which is raised by those discussions and by this panel is a political one in the international sphere. The mission of partners is very close to the mission of an organization like the Community of Democracies or the NGO arm that I'm associated with, the Council for a Community of Democracies. Your process almost cries out for a link between the two because the missions are quite different. And my question is, has partners ever considered making a link between the process that leads to the democracies that you're talking about, democracies, in fact, on all kinds of subjects, to an organization, an effort that wants to link these democracies into a community that deals with peace through community and through democracy. And that's, I think, a central question that we face in talking with you at Partners. And I'd like to hear an answer to it here.
No pressure. Thank you, Dick. Okay, well, we've got a couple of questions. Nika, I don't know, do you want to talk about the financial independence? Because we do indeed have very concrete data on where their money came from.
In the longer report, which is about, 120 pages, that was one of the questions, was looking to see how many funders do they have, what percentage of their budget do they provide, and what kind of funders in terms of, is it donors, is it grants, is it contracts, is it fee-for-service, is it a for-profit sister business or some other kind of arrangement? And basically, in terms of the number of funders, they have an average of 6 funders each. And I was trying to actually find, maybe some of you have better knowledge about this, but looking to see, well, what's a good indicator? What's a good target? I mean, obviously you want 100 different funders, but what is the minimum recommended number of funders? And some of the research I found said, well, certainly you don't want any one funder providing more than 65% of your budget, and none of them have that. And others said, you want several donors providing 10% or more, so you're getting a good enough chunk from some big organizations, but not so big that if one of them pulls out, you're left high and dry. And the majority of them have, have that, funders that provide 3 or more funders that provide 10% each. The more recently, though, that was one of the challenges with at least one of the centers in the Sustainable Leadership Program, where they had a huge funder, a business. So it was a corporate funding, not GE, corporate funding, and they thought, oh, this is going to be our key to sustainability, is to really nurture that business community. Unfortunately, when the contract ended, it didn't get extended, and they didn't have a replacement, and so they had 22 staff and laid off pretty much everybody, and kind of basically said they had to start over. And be much more strategic and slow in their growth. And in fact, some of the donors that I talked to for this also said, slow growth is better than rapid growth for a number of reasons. The other so all of them have some mix of grants, contracts, fee-for-service. The way that the for-profit or fee-for-service works is different depending on the center. Some of them literally have created for-profit arms. And how that works is also different. Some of them use staff in both. So some of their work is for the for-profit mediation center, and work on training and capacity building is through grants and funders. So they have different arrangements. Some of the centers that started a for-profit business got divorced from their for-profit business, their sister business, because that business decided, hey, we're doing really good. We don't need you anymore. And because we're independent, see ya, So that hasn't worked for all of the ones that started that. But there is, from what it looks like, a pretty good mix of the types of funders. The amount of funding is they're not over reliant, but that could change quickly if all the same donors suddenly pull out, if all the projects end at the same time. Does that kind of capture all of those?
Yeah, if you want, I can just very quickly, because we are going to have to wrap up. I'm sure you all kind of have on your calendars up until, thank you, until 11. So just 11. Yeah, no, that's all right. So essentially, I wanted to just, this fee for services, that's embedded from day one in what we do with the centers, because essentially, it's hard to create this concept of entrepreneurialism and sustainability afterwards. If you've been kind of running around doing projects for grants and you're not thinking, all right, that grant paid for a training program. How do I capture that training program in a way that I can then sell it later? What's the book that came out of that project, and how do I sell that later? Where are the clients? We're constantly working with the centers to think about their own products and services from the moment that we've been setting them up. So it's been a key, I think, sustainability strategy. This question about identifying real social entrepreneurs, I would be very happy. We have a full evaluation of the Sustainable Leadership program, which was only based on finding the right person and investing in them. And, it's fun. And so we got a whole bunch. I've got a list. I can't think of all of them now. But, one of the key aspects was, is that individual reflective about the impact that they personally have in their environment? And can they work with us in a way to then be, and I know that sounds kind of touchy-feely, but, rigid perfectionists that, have a certain way of thinking about how it needs to be in their country, where it's fairly difficult to invest in them. But, were they adaptable, reflective, willing to say that worked, this didn't work, I've got this vision, but not just in the clouds, I really can, help make it kind of practical, was just this constant sense of reflection about what they were doing. And we were right there with them, wanting to kind of process. And so some folks weren't even really willing to reflect with us sometimes, and that was an indicator. So I'm happy to share more about, because we do have a long list of kind of the, in Teresa, I keep looking at Teresa because she's the one who helped do that study. Talk to Teresa afterwards, and she could probably tell you the list off the top of her head. Really quickly about competing with each other with donors. That absolutely happens. There's somebody from the National Endowment for Democracy here, and they get a lot of proposals from partner centers, and USIP gets a lot of proposals from centers. But, these are local NGOs. If they've got a good project that, it has something to do in their country, then, they deserve to kind of compete and win. We try and coordinate with each other. We all say to each other, I just submitted this to the UN Democracy Foundation. What are you submitting? We're not as good at that kind of knowledge management, but, we're all competing, based on, the quality of our work. And I think that that's appropriate in an international network. Where it gets complicated is when we are competing as the kind of international arm or, hub with those centers. And we've gotten a lot better on carving out a different niche for us that isn't the bilateral investment in their countries. And our niche is about regional approaches, about multiple countries, about bringing in other organizations and kind of facilitating coalitions to work. So we're not competing for that project in Albania with our Albanian colleagues. And then finally, I've got to speak to Dick's question just about us linking with other international organizations who are democracy promoters. That has absolutely become our role at Partners. And that was really what my closing remarks were going to be, is that what we do now is much less of this bilateral investment. Although we have to take all of this, what we just presented, all of this knowledge, all of this experience, and think about, all right, well, what does this mean if we're going to a country like Kenya that has a lot of really sophisticated local organizations doing good work, and we want to contribute to that process in a meaningful way without establishing a Partners Kenya to compete with all of those organizations. So is there a way of potentially affiliating with existing organizations, inviting them into our network, being an authentic partnership with them, and then being a link with other international platforms like the Voluntary Principles at the UN, for example, or other platforms where we're promoting on a global basis these principles and these ways of being in the world. I had a lot more to say. Happy to stick around and talk with you all. I really just want to say thank you very much for joining us this morning. Thank you. We didn't get a chance to take questions from our virtual audience, but Jess is shaking her head, so that's all right. And just a very special thank you to the GE Foundation, again, for their support and for joining us this morning. Thank you, Deb.
Thank you for having us. Great report. Nice job. Very nice job. It's good to be here.
very much.
Very nice job. Oh, thank you for your question. I appreciate that.